My own background is in teacher education, where I'm currently researching and evaluating a large longitudinal study of iPad use by pre-service teachers. And you can see some images taken here of those teachers or trainee teachers using their iPads in different phases of the programme. I'm currently also leading a European Erasmus Plus project, which investigates how we can use mobile technologies like this to transform the pedagogical practices of teachers in higher education, such as teacher educators. And this is a really important issue because in our own university, we've seen a dramatic shift in terms of the types of technologies that students are bringing to the university with them. So here, for example, in 2013-2014 is a picture of the technologies students brought with them, and predominantly, if you add together the smartphones and the tablet devices, there were more mobile devices than there were fixed, particularly if you include a laptop. But when we fast forward to 2014-2015, this has been even more exaggerated. So the fixed PC has diminished. Very few students now buying or bringing to university one of those, but the laptop and increasingly the tablet and the smartphone are becoming the devices of choice for students. And in many cases we are finding that students are already arriving at the university equipped with these mobile technologies, expecting that their university course and their preparation for being a teacher will take advantage of the mobility and the affordances associated with them. And that's what the project that I'm talking about here, our Erasmus Plus project, is designed to achieve. It's working with 5 university partners and 4 schools across Europe and Australia to investigate how we might transform the pedagogical practices in these institutions through the effective use of mobile devices. The idea is eventually to produce a learning toolkit that teachers will be able to use to help them improve their use of these devices. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about some of the theoretical background as to why it's important that teacher educators understand how to use mobile technologies effectively. And I want to focus first of all on books, which I see as something of a Trojan horse. And the reason I see them as a Trojan horse is because I think that by changing or challenging teacher educators' conceptualizations of books will also encourage them to think about their pedagogical practices. Now, the idea of knowledge building is an idea that was developed in the 90s by Marlene Scardamalia and Carl Bereiter. And for them, it was a very distinct form of learning. It was about working collaboratively to generate something original, to make a contribution to what already was known. And for them, most of what we call learning was actually just an accumulation of existing knowledge rather than the creation of new knowledge. And in producing eBooks, that's what we believe students, whether they be trainee teachers or whether they be undergraduate students or indeed school students, should be involved in. At one extreme, there'll be young learners building knowledge because they're inquisitive. And of course, at the other extreme, we've got what we might call the disciplined creativity of the mature knowledge producer. And what we need to do is to develop a bridge between the two. All learners, I believe, are naturally inquisitive. We need to give them opportunities in formal education to demonstrate that inquisitiveness by the production of really deep, constructivist knowledge which is original. And one way we can tap into that is by encouraging them to create their own books. And for me, that's where I see the future of ebooks. It's not in terms of consumption, but rather it's in terms of creation. And more importantly, collaborative creation. If we think of the traditional modelling of authoring, the traditional way in which books are produced, generally speaking, there's only one author who sits at the top of the pyramid. And below that, we have the publisher who assists that author to get into print. And below that, the vast majority of us our readers. The author, of course, is very active. He or she writes and produces the text, the narrative. But the reader is largely passive. Most of what they're doing is consumption. They're consuming the narrative that's been presented to them. And in the middle, we've got the gatekeepers, or the publishers. I believe we can turn this model on its head, and we can make the reader an active, constructive player in this process of authoring books. So does that mean that the book is dead? We've heard this many times. We've heard people talking about the imminent death of the book. I don't think this is necessarily the case. And indeed, if the book is going to die, as Matt McInnes tells us, it's unlikely to be killed off by the ebook. However, that doesn't mean that we don't need to be thinking of alternatives. Books serve a particular purpose, but there are alternatives. Matt McInnes, the CEO of the company Inklin, argues that traditional books are effectively paper under glass, what we refer to as print books, and traditional ebooks, that is, really doing very little different than traditional. Now, in one sense, it's evident to some that ebooks are the future, and as these statistics appear to show, the growth of the ebooks has been dramatic over the period since 2010, which coincides with the release of the iPad. But the book is not yet dead. 2012 was probably the low point for print, when the sales of print-based books reached their lowest point. But in 2014, there's evidence that books had begun to rise again in popularity, not large, but nonetheless, it bucks the trend. And this is some of the evidence to support why that might be the case. This is a study that was undertaken by HP based on students in San Jose University in California. And as you can see from these figures, they discovered that most students preferred to read print rather than ebooks. When we drill down into this, we find why this might be the case. These are the reasons that students gave for choosing print textbooks rather than ebooks. And what strikes you there perhaps is the ease of use. Most of them think print textbooks are particularly easy to use. They also like the ability to write in the margins of books, something that some would say was heretical, but it's an easy thing to do with a pen to make notes. Cost seems to be relatively insignificant in terms of the favouriting of print books. If we look at the reverse, what are the reasons for choosing textbooks? Well, as we might imagine, they're very light, they're convenient to some extent, some evidence to suggest that the fact you can search easily for keywords and so on is important. But what strikes me here is how low, in terms of ranking, note-taking and interactivity were. 6% and 5% respectively. And these are some of the affordances which are often heralded as being the game winner for ebooks. Why ebooks are so significant compared to traditional books. And yet, in terms of readers, these are relatively unimportant. So why might that be the case? And I would argue it's not that they don't like note-taking or interactivity per se. It's that traditional ebooks at the moment really do not take advantage of these affordances. And we are not yet seeing these type of affordances which set ebooks apart from traditional textbooks becoming common, particularly in school textbooks. Perhaps we shouldn't be all that surprised by those findings about how students perceive textbooks and, by comparison, how they perceive the ebook. Neil Postman talked about the fact that all technologies, whether they be traditional print books, computers, televisions and so on, are effectively metaphors through which we conceptualize our reality. And he went on to say that it's through these media metaphors that we see the world not as it is, but as our coding systems allow us to see it. So, for example, print-based books are coded in such a way that we're encouraged to follow the narrative in a linear manner from page 1 through to the end of the book. Multimedia, hyperlinks and so on, a web page is quite different. It's coded in a different fashion, so that rather than laboriously following through every single web page until we get to the end of a website, we use hyperlinks to jump about, and in that sense we follow a non-linear pattern. So it's very important to understand the coding systems that these technologies bring with them. And a question I want to pose to you before the end of this section is whether or not we are currently really understanding what the coding systems for the ebook actually offer as compared to what we are currently using them for. In this section of